Our next speaker, John Davies. Where is he? There we go. Tissue Regeneration Therapeutics is the name of the company that he founded, and he's a Canadian. He's a very dynamic speaker, so I'm going to keep a good distance from him and not try edging up on him when he's speaking, because I might get hit.
But in the cord blood industry itself, of course, we're going through some radical changes. There are an increasing number of clinical indications for cord blood. The accreditation and the standards that we're having to abide by are increasing and improving with time. And the industry is maturing, so all of this is good. It's a dynamic environment, but at the same time, we've got some distraction for your patients, that is, or your clients, from the iPS and the embryonic stem cell sector, which is all very exciting, but of course years and years away from clinical usefulness. The whole cord blood industry, as we heard this morning, is commoditized with services with low entry barriers. That's a problem too. We've got some industry consolidation going on. That can be good in some cases, but it certainly represents a lot of change. And then we have the issue about either storing cord blood or storing cord blood and cord tissue. So what's the key challenge? And I want to address my remarks mostly to those people who are not already in companies storing or offering a cord tissue product, although I'll be mentioning several of those. I'd prefer to address my comments to people who are wanting to get into this area. And what's the big key issue that you're facing? And that is to differentiate your company from the rest in this very evolving and dynamic environment. And the issues which we face are that we have to decide which we're going to target to differentiate, the hematopoietic system or the tissue system, mesenchymal cells, or whatever you're going to call them. And if we make that choice, then secondarily, what is the differentiator? And of course, we could talk about price, and your clients are always interested in how much the service is going to cost, and that's perfectly reasonable. We could talk, and although I'm not going to, about incentivization of the OBGYN community so that you can actually influence them in recommending your product. Or we could talk about the clinical and scientific merit of the product that you're going to go for. So between hematopoietic and tissue in general, if we go to the hematopoietic system, of course, there's a very low differentiation potential. Just about anybody can start with the requisite background, of course, a cord blood bank. And in terms of IP, patents, protection, this sort of thing, there's very little to stop you doing that. So the differentiation between cord blood banks is low, although some claim because they've got one storage system or another that makes them better or different, but nevertheless, this is not a big deal. In the tissue area, however, the potential for differentiation is very high. And it depends on whether you actually go for cord tissue and you store that, or you actually extract cells. Now, some of this we've already heard about throughout the day from almost every talk. Somebody's mentioned something about cord tissue. One thing I want to correct. We heard this morning from one of the speakers that this is a new area that's just research-based and it's not in clinical. Well, that's absolutely wrong. This represents 27 studies, clinical studies, that are going on today using umbilical cord tissue for a whole range of applications or clinical indications which are represented on this slide. Now, you can see the pictures, and they range vastly from treatment of diabetes to cirrhosis. And I'm not going to list the other ones. If you can't see them, then I'll willingly show you this slide later again. So this is an area which is already in clinical practice. The fact that it's past the research stage doesn't mean to say that research has to continue in this area, but it's far past that. For your information, the first transplant of MSCs was actually in 2004, so that's almost a decade ago. That was for the treatment of graft versus host disease. So how do you differentiate? Well, you can go for the money. Either the price or the incentivization, and that's the bit of the story I'm not going to talk about. Or you can go and try and differentiate by differentiating in front of the medical profession, which is actually either the OBGYN community or somebody else that nobody else has talked about today. So who is the target? If you want to actually say that you're differentiating your technology because you have a technology which will allow your patient, and given your patient the assurance and the insurance that they will be able to use these cells later on. Do you target the patient? That's one person. Do you target the OBGYN physicians? It's another possibility. Or with your technology, do you try and target the transplant specialists? And I'll again point out to the fact that this morning when the thalassemia argument was used, the thalassemia argument was used for cord blood because, why? It's being used clinically. It's the clinical applications of the cells which will drive the growth of this industry. I can spout as much as I like about science, and I'm actually a scientist by training as well as a clinician. But unless we get the cells in the hands of clinicians using them for clinical therapy, the whole thing is useless. So actually convincing the transplanters is a very important part of this equation. So the patients, of course, they're interested in price, realistically. But they also want a product which is going to be useful. So assuming that you're talking to patients who don't have a medical background, then they're going to be influenced by your marketing pitch. And so there's a great responsibility on companies, whether their marketing pitch is in fact correct or accurate or whatever. I won't go into any other adjectives. But the patient is somewhat at the liberty is constrained by their lack of detailed information and therefore is influenced very much by marketing. The OBGYNs, of course, couldn't care less how much the price is of the product because they're not paying. But they do want a product which makes some medical sense. And how are they going to do that? They're busy doing their job. So they're going to be influenced by the marketing. The transplanter, however, is a very different kettle of fish. The transplanter is actually influenced by medical evidence of the therapeutic benefit of the cells. They're influenced by the convenience of using the cells and the SOPs which have been developed to use the cells for therapeutic ends. And lastly, but very importantly, and this depends upon the jurisdiction in which you work, of course, the transplanters are influenced by the regulatory framework in which they abide. So the targets are different. Which do you aim for? And what products do you use? Well, what's out there? If you want to get into this business, there are a number of options. The first is that you can take an umbilical, I don't know where the pointer is. Maybe it's that one. Oh, yeah, it is. You can take an umbilical cord and you can chop it up into bits, or little bits like this, very little bits. And you can put it in liquid nitrogen. And there it will abide for as long as you like, cryopreserved, and leave it there. I call this the ostrich approach. Bury your head in the sand. I had another name for it before, but I can't use that here. Such exalted company. The biggest company in the United States and the biggest company in Europe actually use this approach. They have no cells extracted. Therefore, they have no cell product. Therefore, they have nothing to transplant. They leave it all to the patient. So when the patient wants the cells, they say, yes, we'll give them back. We'll give you the bits of tissue back from our cryopreservation. And it's up to you how you deal with the issue then. I'll leave it to you to decide whether you like that option. A slightly better approach, and one which I think works and can work clinically, is that you start off with the umbilical cord, as you did before. You chop it up into little pieces, and now you extract the cells. You put the cells in some container, and you put the container in the liquid nitrogen. So now you're actually cryopreserving cells. And this, of course, means that you've got a cell population. This is good, because you have cells which are extracted. You have a mixed cell population because you've just chopped up the whole cord, and there are very many different types of cells in the umbilical cord, which you all know. endothelial cells, epithelial cells, mesenchymal cells, fibroblasts, myofibroblasts, smooth muscle cells, just to name a few. It's a mixed cell population, but nevertheless, you have a cell therapy product. You do need patent licensing, and contrary to what some of you heard in one of the round tables at lunchtime today, I would earnestly advise you to pay attention to the patent estates which are out there, because those people who advise you to ignore the fact that you've got people who've got patent coverage are actually, it's okay for them because they don't have a cord blood company of their, of their own, but it's putting you in some difficult situation. So you need patent coverage for this sort of thing because you're taking cells out in an umbilical cord where, as you'll see in a minute, there's quite a lot of patent coverage. But the big thing about this is that, of course, what you're giving the patient is some reassurance that they've got a product. And so here you're storing something which is actually potentially useful for the patient. The other alternative is to actually look at the distribution of the cells in the umbilical cord and decide, okay, am I going to extract a particular cell type rather than mashing up the whole cord? And this is a diagram which Maury Krauss used this morning, but it actually comes from a paper published by Sugar et al. In 2009. This is not my data, it's not my figure, but I rather like it because what they did is they rigorously took cross-sections of human umbilical cords and they plotted the distribution of cells within the tissue. So all of the green dots, all of the green dots here represent individual cells within the umbilical cord tissue, or the Wharton's jelly as the last speaker referred to it. And the brown stuff is the smooth muscle cell of the 3 vessels, and the green stuff are the mesenchymal cells of various types. I'll come back to why I say various types. The blue line on the outside is the amniotic epithelium, represented by a single line. It's a single cell layer. You'll notice this is, not, again, not my figure, but that calculation of Sugar et al., that 77% of the cells within this tissue lie within the perivascular zones here. So, what are the options for you? You can take the perivascular tissue out. This is, oops, I've done it again. This is covered by extensive worldwide patents, several estates. These are patents which have actually been issued or allowed, so they exist. This is true IP. It dates back to 2003, so this is actually quite mature technology now. The patents cover all methods of extraction, so the people now who try to file patents saying they'll extract these cells by a different method, but in fact they can't do that without infringing. The patents cover all cell phenotypes, or part of the cell phenotype, and of course, as I've said, and Sugar said, this is the richest source of the MSCs, the perivascular space. An alternative is you rip the vessels out with the perivascular tissue, and you end up with this. This is the remaining 23% of the cells, and as you see, this contains fair number of mesenchymal cells, but also the amniotic epithelium. This is also protected by a patent application. It's not issued yet. It's a relatively new publication date, 2013, but dates to a priority of 2010. And again, you get, in this case, 2 tissue types, epithelial and mesenchymal, because of course you've got the amniotic epithelium there. And as the last speaker said, because in fact this is the technology exercised by that company, the native cells can be used without expansion. So you've got enough cells in this from the cord to actually use straight away should you need them. Not bad, but as you see, you've only got 23% of the cells in the first place. The alternative is another system that we heard about this morning, and that is that you can just rip off the lining of the cord, which is represented here, which is the amniotic epithelium and the few mesenchymal cells which lie within it. This too is covered by a patent application. Again, notice it's an application, it's not an issued patent, neither of the last 2 were. Again, a very recent filing date. Goes back to 2009. Again, 2 types of cells, epithelium, mesenchyme, and in this case, one of the companies involved says that they'll just do this from 5 to 10 inches of the cord. So they take a relatively small piece of the cord, and of course, as you see, get very few cells. These are the options available to you based on the patent or patent pending estates. So no doubt about it, and you don't have to take my word for it because this is in the published literature, the rich source of cells is in the perivascular region. And that's actually not surprising because we know the provenance of these cells. And if you look at the first trimester cord, this is a cord stained for CD146. The smooth muscle is positive for CD146. Outside that, there's no staining. Some of you may be able to see blue dots, which are the cells out there stained with DAPI. But there are very, very few cells in the perivascular space which are staining with CD146 positive. By a term cord here, not only have you got a well-developed endothelium, which is also positive CD146, but you've got all of these CD146 cells now in the perivascular space. So we know that the cells actually grow out from the vessels, and that's not surprising, as that's where all the cells are, as we saw before. And because they proliferate very rapidly, we can actually do expansion, and this is a very complicated graph with lots and lots of different experimental results superimposed. But you can see very clearly that if you can't see my pointer because the battery's just gone, but I can walk. I can walk, thank you. So you can see as I trip over the screen, these are the cells expanding in number. This is passage 0, 1, 2, 3, and by between 2 and 3 passages up here, we've got 10 billion cells expanded from one umbilical cord. So this is repeatable. This can be done now in serum-free conditions, ready for clinical use. By the way, the whole procedure can be done like that. And so you can get massive numbers of cells from this perivascular system. That's not really surprising either, because we know that it has the biggest colony-forming unit. We had a CFUF in the previous presentation. And you take that perivascular tissue, and at harvest, the frequency of CFUFs is 1 in 300. But by the time you passage a couple of times, that CFUF frequency increases to 1 in 3, which is the highest CFUF frequency in a mesenchymal population ever described. But what this means, what these numbers mean, if you've got a frequency of 1 in 300, it means one cell in 300 is essentially an MSC, a mesenchymal stem cell, which means that 299 are not stem cells. And that's why the whole population should be called stromal cells, because very few, even at this number, very few are actually stem cells. In your bone marrow, as you sit there listening to me, if I was to come and extract your bone marrow, one cell in every 100,000 cells, nucleated cells, would be an MSC. So to put it in perspective, these are still very high numbers at 1 in 300, and certainly extremely high at 1 in 3. So this is a very good source of cells. And as a result, over the years, and this is data published in 2009 from our university group, we were able to replot the MSC differentiation hierarchy, cells which produce 5 lineages, 4 lineages in their differentiation, 3, 2, and 1. All of these cells in this cartoon, this is all coming from robust scientific evidence, all of these cells in the cartoon are actually stem cells. They're all mesenchymal stem cells, but they've got different differentiation capacity, which means that there isn't one single type of MSC. There are a whole family of different MSCs, and those MSCs, the mesenchymal stem cells, only represent a relatively small number of the total population of cells which we extract from this tissue. The old concept from Arnie Kaplan was very different, where you had this uni-lineage differentiation pattern here, which simply doesn't exist. Again, this is all published in 2009 in PLOS One, so this is peer-reviewed. Also, we were able to do flow cytometry. We do this on a regular basis. These cells exceed the ISCT criteria for mesenchymal stromal cells. ISCT is International Society of Cellular Therapy. And as you see, they're 100% positive for CD105, 1973. There are other markers like this which change with passage in culture, CD146, MHC1, and other things. They change with, but they maintain their MSC character. So in vitro, thank you. In vitro, these cells can differentiate into various different lineages of the connective tissue family. But interestingly and importantly, we've shown that they can do that in vivo. So these cells generate bone and cartilage in vivo. They generate collagen in dermal wound healing. They stimulate angiogenesis. Why? Because in fact, the most important aspect of these cells is their paracrine signaling rather than their differentiation. So while these cells differentiate into muscle, fat, bone, cartilage, and fibrous tissue. They are also immunomodulatory. They calm down the immune response, the inflammatory response. They're antibacterial, which has now been shown, and they're angiogenic, as I've just mentioned. How does it happen? Lots of molecular signaling, much of which we still don't understand. This is from work from Karen English, which I don't have time to go into. But it does explain this diagram. Remember, this is all clinical work being done with umbilical cord tissue-derived MSCs. And you see now that many of these indications, like diabetes, gastroenterological, which is basically Crohn's disease, the co-administration of the hematopoietic stem cells, this has nothing to do with their differentiation and everything to do with their paracrine signaling. Also the treatment of cirrhosis, huge issue in China, and is all to do with calming the inflammatory reaction in these diseases. So are these cells useful? Yes. Are they being used clinically? Yes. It's no longer just a research idea. And can you get lots of these cells from the umbilical cord? Yes, if you mine them in the right place. And be careful. Watch out for people's patents. And just ignore people who tell you to ignore other people's patents. Greg. I've got my spies everywhere. Two last slides. One, to say that these cells have been shown completely by others, again, independent work, that these cells actually outperform both adipose cells, adipose-derived MSCs, and bone marrow-derived MSCs. We've heard about both in different talks today. So these cells are better than those cells from adult tissues. It's a very important message to take to your clients. And the last one is this one, published by a neighbor of ours, Armand Keating. Many of you know Armand Keating. He was the president of ASH, American Society of Hematology, last year. So a very well-respected hematologist-oncologist. And his group published a paper comparing our cells with bone marrow-derived cells. And one of his quotes here saying that these cells, human umbilical cord perivascular cells, basically outperform bone marrow cells, mesenchymal cells. So these cells are, in fact, very useful. The advantages, they're rich, cost-effective source of best-in-class MSCs, higher numbers than anywhere else in the cord tissue, simple harvesting procedure, which I haven't had time to go into, high proliferation rate. So cells can be stored and expanded, as you can see here, ready for clinical use in clinical valid conditions. They exceed established criteria. There's extensive peer-reviewed international scientific validation plus patenting. Can be used for all members of the family without problem because these cells can be used autologously or allogeneically, proven clinical utility, and they are currently, of course, as I've said now a couple of times, being used for multiple indications. I've just gone a little bit over my time, but if you want any more information, go to our website, www.verypowerfulbiology, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks very much.
John, thank you. So I'm a firm believer in the technology that you have, and I'm also a fan of Ruse's technology and where there might be any potential IP crossover or anything like that. I'm sure you guys all work out. I'm far more concerned with, even if these processing methods are the best thing since sliced bread and give a better quality of cells, a number of cells, whether the cord blood market, based on cost constraints, will accept and buy into the fact of paying for the license agreements to be able to do that, and whether the far majority of the cord blood banks will accept the current system, or I shouldn't say current system, but the easier and most cost-effective system of not necessarily licensing, getting perhaps a lower quality of product, but moving forward in that aspect just because of the fact of, you know, the cost of the license agreements.
It's a very long statement and sort of several questions buried in there, but the quick answer is we already know that there are many companies out there who are offering a product, some of which I mentioned, which don't include any extraction of cells at all. So the processing for that is very cheap. It's very cost effective. They happen to be charging the same as anybody else who's doing a bona fide treatment, by the way, and bona fide product. But nevertheless, they're out there. They're doing that. They're probably making a lot of money. And that's the ostrich mentality, which I simply in public do not want to talk about anymore. Otherwise, I'll get too excited. So yes, we have to understand that driven exclusively by financial reasons, companies will try go out there and make a quick buck at the patient's expense. But I would put it to you, each one of you in this room, that we're here, and this was said very clearly in our first talk this morning, that we're here to actually generate therapies for patients. So despite the fact, I represent a company, I founded the company, I want our company to succeed, I've got a vested interest in my company, but at the same time, and possibly, having started my life as a clinician, I also think that we have to keep that in consideration. And to offer a product which is no use to a gullible parent or parents at the time of the birth of their child, which you know damn well is not going to be any use to the patient later on, is not a way to do responsible business. Can I stop there? Because I don't want to say any more. But you've got the gist.
And this is the last question. Concise one.
Hey, John. Thanks for a great talk. I have 2 comments. One, I'm an innocent man wrongfully accused.
No, apparently not.
I did not say, if anybody heard me say that I think you should ignore people's patents, didn't say that, didn't mean that. All I'm saying is that the patent landscape that we exist in here is a patent thicket. There are competing patents everywhere, and you should pay attention to people's patents. You should respect people's patents. But if you have a patent, you're likely to have somebody else out there who's got a competing patent. You're going to have to deal with it. That was all I was saying.
Okay, so actually, let me counteract that then. I won't counteract it, but let me comment on that, because if you if what you said was misconstrued, I think it's been very useful right now that you've put the record straight, that you're not saying people should ignore others' patents. So that's
absolutely
fine.
not.
I think that's very good.
I spent half my career as a patent lawyer. So
no, that's great. That's great.
I get this.
But obviously,
so
you're
the question I
misunderstood.
have for you, and I appreciate the clinical work and your pitch, and I really am very respectful of the work you've done. Are you guys doing any clinical trials on using your particular MSC cells as co-therapy with cord blood to promote engraftment?
No.
Or perhaps expansion?
We are not doing any co-engraftment with cord blood.
Fran? Thank you very much.